If you look at the various educational reforms, including the ones that I put in place in the Chicago Public Schools, the emphasis has been largely, or frankly entirely, on skills. Right? If we can ramp up the skills, if we can make skills instruction better in one way or another, kids are going to do better. And in fact, we have a substantial body of research that says that if you teach kids things like phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, they do better. Just no question about it. It's a no-brainer. National Reading Panel reviewed the research. I was part of that. No question. And the cognitive skills, things like teaching kids things like comprehension strategies. Again, substantial research that says there's a benefit. Some of you have worked with me on some of those kinds of things. But we have a problem, and the problem is this. Let me give it to you nationally, and then let me give it to you locally. Nationally, the problem is we have been reforming schools like crazy since 1983 or 84, since, a nation at risk? We've made so many changes, so much improvement, and yet reading achievement in the United States is as flat as a pancake. Well, it's not entirely. Our fourth graders are doing about that much better than fourth graders have done any time in history. So our fourth graders are the best reading fourth graders we've ever had, but by that much. We've spent billions on this. I mean, heck, my first year here in the Chicago schools, I spent $25 million just locally on our teachers and principals, on some of you. I mean, that's the reality of it. And yet, reading achievement has stayed flat. And so you go, okay, let's get some new reform. Let's get going after these Common Core standards. Let's pursue this new test or not pursue this new test, whatever they're deciding right now. What makes you think if we just double down on all this that we're going to see much higher achievement? I mean, I'm certainly not saying we shouldn't be doing these things. There's no question these things give kids an advantage. If you can't decode the text, if you can't turn it into language, how are you ever going to understand it? If you can't think about the ideas in text effectively, how are you ever going to do well in the workplace? How are you ever going to do well in college and so on? But trying to continually upgrade instruction in those areas, and I'm not backing down on those, but clearly something's missing, guys. You know, what we're doing isn't enough. It might be necessary, but it certainly isn't sufficient, right? Put it in scientific terms. So what's missing? And what I would suggest, my nominee, is language. We teach the heck out of the decoding skills so the kids can turn the squiggles on the page into language. And once they have the ideas, we give them the tools that will help them remember those and think about those ideas effectively, summarize and question themselves and all that kind of thing so they can think about the ideas. But the assumption is always, if we can translate the text to the language, and then we can take the language and turn it into something else, it'll all be wonderful. But what makes you think the kids can process the language really well? Where does that come from? Where does that belief, where does that commitment come from? Because we're not doing much there. We do a few little things. We teach vocabulary. That improves language. I know several people around various tables tonight have mentioned vocabulary to me. We do some other things with language, little bits. The fact is, the new standards that Illinois has adopted does something that is it has never done in the past. It's absolutely critical that you understand that the standards specify something they've never specified before, and that is these standards don't just give you a whole list of skills the kids have to learn. Oh, they have those. But they also say that boys and girls have to be able to read text at a certain level of difficulty. Let's do it this way. Think of it like this. Imagine, let's go back to, I think it was about 1987, 1988, that Illinois first put state educational standards in place. I'm not so good at remembering those dates, but I worked on that stuff, so I remember. And those standards were long lists of reading skills that we thought boys and girls needed to learn and that we thought the teachers should teach. So So let's imagine that our state legislature, in its infinite wisdom, and that is the humor here tonight, folks. Those are the guys who are in control of our pensions. I know, yeah. Let's imagine that at the time they had decided not to have reading standards for our boys and girls, but to have weightlifting standards. I know it's hard to imagine, but think about our state legislature as possible. So we have weightlifting standards, and if we wrote them the same way that people like me wrote the reading standards, they'd be somewhat repetitive. Remember our standards before Common Core? Things like, kindergartners will draw inferences. First graders will draw inferences. Second graders will draw inferences. It kind of went all the way up. Well, let's imagine now that we wrote that. What would we say? We'd say things like, kindergartners need to know how to do arm curls. See, there's a reason for this. I'm not just having a stroke. 3 glasses of red wine, a stroke is impossible. Okay. I visit schools all the time. And teachers tell me, this is my 4th grade, the 4th grade classroom. Let's say these are my low readers. I'm teaching the 4th grade standards, but we're working in a 2nd grade book because these are my low readers. And what Common Core and the state of Illinois are saying to you folks is that if you're doing the exercise that we've specified, if you're figuring out the main idea, if you're comparing the characters, if you're doing all the different kinds of skills, tasks, exercises, we're going to also add one little dimension to it. Is there any problem with my arm curls? No, does that matter? If you put weight on there, I couldn't do this, man. I mean, for a man my age, this is a remarkable number of arm curls. I'm not going to show you tonight because we're in a hurry, but under this jacket, I'm cut. I kind of resent that laughter, I know. My wife told me you wouldn't believe me. The fact is, what these new standards are saying is if you're doing the 4th grade exercises with 2nd grade weights, you're doing the 2nd grade standards, not the 4th grade standards. So the very first time our standards set a language level that boys and girls have to be able to negotiate to meet the standards, and that's a big difference than in the past. There's more to it than that, but let me just hold off to defend that idea. And then, honestly, if I get this done in like 2 or 3 minutes, and you want to go home, I have a lot more to share, but I honestly believe this will be worth your time tonight. The data I'm sharing with you, this is just, you can see this is a bad photocopy, and I want people to see these are not my data. I had nothing to do with the collection of these data. There are data here based on 490,000 high school juniors across the United States. This is from the ACT. Our kids take the ACT. Real fast setup. The kids' scores that are summarized above, these are their ACT scores. So 36 is perfect, 11 is near the bottom. Slightly over 21 is what ACT used to say was college ready. They'd moved that up just ever so slightly to the right. So if you get a 17 on the ACT, this is where your data are. This is the percentage of reading comprehension questions that the boys and girls answered correctly. So 100% up there, 0 down there. Obviously what this shows is kids who get low ACT scores read less well than kids who get high ACT scores. Well, that's not surprising. You knew that. Can you see that there are 2 lines there? One of those summarizes how the kids do on literal recall. That is those questions where the answer is stated right there. It's explicitly in the text. All you have to do is locate it or remember it. And the other ones are all those higher order reasoning questions that we talk about, all those inferences and interpretations and connections. What do you notice about the 2 lines? They're really close. In fact, statistically, they're identical. There's no difference among them. Even those little places where you see openings, that's just noise. That's just statistical noise. There's nothing there. What that's telling you is it doesn't matter if you're an especially low reader, if you're an average reader, if you're a superstar, you don't perform any differently on test questions that ask you right there questions, low level, just did they get what the text said, or those higher order reasoning ones that we've hit you over the head with for years and years. There is absolutely no difference in performance for anybody. That surprise anybody? Bother anybody? Look at this one. Because ACT stayed with it. They didn't just give up after that. They went, what if we break our questions out? Main idea questions, supporting details questions, relationships among characters and relationships among ideas questions, vocabulary questions, drawing conclusions questions. One line. Absolutely no difference among any of those. The most popular way of trying to raise test scores in the Chicago public schools is for teachers and principals to look at the test data, to look at how we do on our state testing, and the other tests that we give, analyze the items just like ASCD says we should, and go through and figure out which kinds of items our kids have trouble with, and then practice the hell out of them. And what these data are telling you is that, in fact, it is impossible to sort out how kids do on those different questions. Because while these data are drawn from the ACT folks, we've been doing studies like this since the 1940s, since 1944, and repeatedly people find again and again standardized reading comprehension tests measure a single skill. They don't measure a whole bunch of skills, they measure one skill. They don't measure main ideas. They don't measure supporting details. They don't measure relationships. Your school superintendent, your school CEO has decided that kids aren't going to take the part, or as somebody pointed out, 90% of the kids aren't going to take the part. I don't want to overstate it. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but whether it happens or not, let me tell you, I think the PARCC test is really a good test. And that said, and it won't do any differently in this than any other standardized reading comprehension test. It doesn't matter whether you're talking the ISAT or the IGAP. It doesn't matter whether you're talking PARCC or SBAC. It doesn't matter if you're talking California Achievement Test or the Iowa Test of Basic Skills or the whole list of them. And the reason for that is because the nature of reading comprehension is such that you can't break out the skills like that. It doesn't work like that. These tests tell you how well kids comprehend, and they do a darn good job of it. People like to say bad things about tests, and people who work on these do a really good job of coming up with a way of identifying who's a good reader and who isn't and so on, and I applaud them. And yet, you cannot use these tests to do what we're doing. I consider this teaching to these tests in this way not only to be the most popular thing in the Chicago schools, but the biggest enemy I ever had in when I was trying to raise achievement. This is the way to make sure it doesn't go up. The reason I'm showing you these is I want to show you why the state has finally set text levels for the kids and why you need to pay attention to the text more and these kinds of skills less. ACT, to their credit, did not give up. See, what you want is the lines to move apart. You want to get some separation so you can figure out what to do diagnostically, so you can figure out what to do instructionally, how to help kids do better. And if the lines all stay close together like that, identical like that, there's absolutely nothing to do. Well, they finally figured it out. Instead of looking at individual items, instead of looking at how do kids do with a particular test question type, they decided to look at the passages themselves. ACT has 4 passages on every test. They don't all, they're not all the same passages and so on. They vary in difficulty. So they had teachers. They gave these teachers a set of rubrics, and they asked the teachers to sort them into essentially 3 piles: uncomplicated passages, more challenging passages, complex passages. Now the lines come apart. You want to see what makes a difference in reading comprehension? It's not the skills, guys, it's the texts. Now the kids at the very bottom, the real strugglers, frankly, within the range of passages that ACT uses, makes no difference. it doesn't matter how easy it is within that range, they can't answer anything, very much of anything. And the superstars I talked about, those kids that they go to Harvard and Yale and Stanford and such places, it doesn't seem to matter how hard the passage is, those kids can answer anything. But for the rest of us, in between those extremes, the other 95% of us, frankly, what makes a difference in our reading comprehension is the demands the passages themselves put on kids. What that means is that if we spend a lot of time, how do you give kids, if you've decided the main idea part of the brain isn't working, so these kids don't, that part of the brain doesn't work, so we have to practice it, and if they practice it enough, they'll be able to answer those kinds of questions. How do you give them a lot of that kind of experience? You give them a lot of text to read, a lot of test passages to read that have main idea questions. But what you really should be doing is giving kids text, substantial text, where it really is a challenge to figure out the main idea. You're not shooting for how many repetitions you can get on that one. You're shooting for how appropriate a context can I put kids into, because this is what makes a difference in comprehension. If you ask the people who wrote the Common Core, and I participated in that process, I helped write them, and ask them, why did you set text levels for so many grade levels? Why did you say that the kids had to be able to manage the language at those levels and negotiate that language to make sense of it? And it's because of the fact that that's where the instruction needs to be. That's what you need to be focusing, not the question types, but the passages. If the passages are easy enough, kids can answer any question type, whatever you think is the hardest one. Oh, but we had like 2-part questions, and the kids had to explain answers. And if the text is easy enough, they can do those. And at the other extreme, frankly, if the text is hard enough, you can't come up with a plan for asking questions that are so simple everyone can answer, because they can't make sense of the information in the text. That's the point. I told you your standards set language levels for the first time. In some ways, even more important, they did a second thing. They set language levels that are higher than what typical grade level programs strive to teach. So if you guys have purchased a core program or have gone to Scholastic and got a set of books that you can have in book room for different grade levels and so on, you probably have texts that hit these kinds of Lexile levels or ATOS levels or DRP levels or all the different schemes that there are out there for. See, Lexiles. What Lexile has been saying, the second and third graders, if you have texts that have the characteristics that measure out to 450 to 730 Lexiles, kids in those grade levels will usually understand those texts if they're reading them. They'll understand those texts with about 75 to 90% comprehension. Look at the levels that the standards say boys and girls have to be reading. These are obviously substantially higher than those. What Common Core has done is notice something. It's amazing, with all the discussions about whether these standards are good or bad, whether we should raise or change standards, or whether we should go back to where we were, whether we should have new tests or stay with the old tests or not have tests, or all the different kinds of things that people are arguing about. It would help if everyone would remember for a moment why any of this is even going on. And I won't use local statistics on this, I'll use national ones, because so many of you are working in such challenged neighborhoods, such challenged schools, that your kids, we know they're low just going in, right? We know the poverty levels are really high. We know the English levels are really low. We know all kinds of things about them, but we certainly know they're not the average American kid, right? They're much more challenged in terms of what confronts them, in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of all kinds of stuff. Employment, crime, brain stuff, all that, So let me give you just the net. Actually, these are also statewide statistics, because Illinois always tracks very nicely with the nation. Big state, diverse state. Right now, more than 70% of the boys and girls in the United States and in Illinois, more than 70%, slightly over 70%, meet or exceed the past standards that we've had. graduate from high school, pretty good. I know it's not true in all your neighborhoods, but 72%, 71% in the state of Illinois graduate from high school, get into college. Pretty impressive, right? Almost 3/4 of the kids. Except for those kids that I'm talking about, those are the ones we're succeeding with. I'm not talking about the kid who drops out. I'm not talking about the kid who, oh gosh, he's going to be on welfare, he can't do this, he can't do that. I'm not talking about those kids. I'm talking about the winners, the ones that we said we won with. Of those 72%, 42% need remediation when they get there. They need remediation in reading, and or writing, and or mathematics. Sometimes one, sometimes two, sometimes all three of those. Why are we raising standards? Because if you meet our past standards, if you meet or exceed them, it means nothing when you leave school. You can't do what you need to do to participate in our economic system. You can't do what you need to do to get a further education. So no one's just jerking your kids, oh gosh, they just want higher standards, they want to show that we're idiots. No, they want higher standards, because if we don't find a way to get appreciably more kids to higher standards, the future of the country, the future of these kids, the future of the state is really suspect. If you look at what's below basic on the national assessment, which is usually what people talk about, they like to talk about those really low kids. We serve so many of those kids here. Those 28% of the kids, everybody knows a lot of them are going to be dropouts. Everybody knows a lot of those kids are going to be on welfare and so on. I hate to say it, it's so cruel and so horrible. In some ways, we've come to accept it. Oh, kids in those neighborhoods just kind of deserve to be there, right? You know, if they wanted it different, they'd clean it up. It's not my fault. You've all heard that stuff. Maybe even some of you have even thought of it. It's hard not to when you get frustrated when you're dealing with this stuff. So we know about those 28% of the kids. You can check my math on this, but I believe 42% of 71% is another 28% of kids. That means I'm not talking about the Chicago public schools anymore. Because 28 and 28 is 56. That means I'm talking about kids who are hitting the 50th percentile on our current tests. I'm talking about kids who are average in the United States. I'm talking about your children. I'm talking about your sister's kids. I'm talking about your neighbor's kids. Because the fact is, a substantial share of those kids don't have the skills when they leave school to participate. And so, if you pull kids up to these kinds of levels instead of those kinds of levels when they leave school, these kids can get jobs. These kids can actually go to college and not need remediation. They can actually get a degree. Something I want to point out, because so many of you are so focused on K1 here and pre-K1. I don't need to say a lot about this slide, but it's enough to just emphasize that this setting of grade level reading standards and this raising those standards to a much higher level than in the past is being done in grades 2 and 3 and 4 and all the way up to 12. It is not being done in grades K and 1. Nobody is asking you to teach kindergartners and first graders with harder text than what we've been doing. The reason for that? Kids have to learn decoding. They have to learn how that system works. And if you ramp up text difficulty too early, too much, you make it harder to figure out that system than it needs to be. I think there's probably not a person in the room who doesn't buy the notion that beginners need some explicit, systematic instruction in phonology and phonics and things like that. But that's only part of the learning that goes into learning to decode text. Explicit instruction, National Reading Panel is absolutely right. 38 studies on phonics, 51 studies on phonological awareness. The National Early Literacy Panel looked at those combined for preschoolers, about 70 studies. There's no question that teaching those things explicitly helps, and yet we also know that the text kids read early on influence that learning, affect that learning. And so what I'm saying to you is there's absolutely no pressure to start ramping that up early on. Don't do it. But here's where the crux of the problem is. It really does hit second grade now. What many schools have been doing is following the idea that students learn most when they're taught from texts that match their instructional levels. Hell, some of you have even been taught that by me. I know that. These standards challenge that. They say you can't afford to teach kids. Whatever the new test is going to be, guys, whether it's Park or something else, your kids are going to be tested at the levels I was just showing you, because those are the standards. And so you say, well, I teach fourth grade, and I've got a youngster who reads at second grade level. Are you telling me they're going to be tested with fourth grade passages, and fourth grade is defined by those standard grades? Because will our kids do well if we spend all of our time teaching them at second grade level because that's their level, and my professor at the university told me that's what I should be doing? See, somebody's right and somebody's wrong on this. Either if you teach kids at their instructional level, and we have so many boys and girls who are below grade level in your schools, when do they ever close the gap? When do they ever get a chance to hit the kind of levels I was showing you? So if every one of you says, well, this kid is 2 years behind, 3 years behind, 4 years behind, that's what we're going to teach them, how much are you going to close that gap? And so in a way, what you're saying is, I'm not even going to give this kid a chance to close it. I'll never put him in that. On the other hand, if your professor at the university was right, and you have to teach kids at their instructional level if they're going to make optimum gains, then making this change, switching kids over to harder text, isn't going to raise achievement, it's going to lower achievement. I don't have time to go through all the research, but what I can tell you is that since this idea was put forth of teaching kids at their instructional level in 1946, not a single study that's tested it, not one, has ever found it to be effective beyond beginning readers. Not one. And there are at least some studies showing that, in fact, kids can make bigger gains when they're placed in frustration level materials. So we've been working our tails off trying to keep kids at their level, and what we've probably been doing is putting a ceiling on what they could possibly learn. But here's the real question, right? You should have a question mark, but I guess I didn't have time to put one. Because here's the scary part. The state, many other states obviously with Common Core, even states like Indiana that aren't part of Common Core, have adopted these particular standards because they get it. They understand that if they don't get kids to higher text levels, we're not going to accomplish what we want. You can teach the skills beautifully forever, but you've got to ramp up those language levels with these kids if we're going to succeed. But I guess even though the research is on that side of it, I still come back to most teachers teach kids at instructional level. Most programs emphasize it. Most big experts in reading and special education and second language learning all insist that we do it. Can I really go from a premise that they're all idiots? Because that doesn't make sense to me. And I never can buy that notion that everybody's an idiot all the time. Why is it that we're so careful not to put kids in harder text? And I would suggest to you the reason is because what happens right now when we put kids in harder text, what happens now when we have a youngster who's reading at a second grade level in a fourth grade class, I think there are 4 things teachers do. From my observations, and we've been doing a heck of a lot of observations, some of us talked about that earlier. Most popular thing, of course, if the text is hard, move the kid to an easier text. He shouldn't have to deal with something that hard. Second most popular, text is hard, read it to the kids. At least they'll get the information. Lousy way to teach kids to read, by the way. Third popular way, especially in the upper grades, tell kids what the texts say. That way they don't have to read them. That solves their problem until they go to college or go out in the workplace. When someone says, here's a training manual, read it. Be ready for work tomorrow morning. Oops. Oh, I've never had to do that before. Yeah, I know. Scary. And the fourth most popular is the old-fashioned way. The teacher just ignores whether kids can handle the text or not, calls on the kids who raise their hands, and moves on, and just leaves those kids behind. clearly those things aren't working. So now everyone's saying, look, the reason kids aren't learning is they're all in the wading pool. You got to get them into deep water if they're going to learn to swim. The question is, what happens when they get into deep water? And so the rest of this 5 or 6 minutes that I have is to show you how to give these kids water wings. At least to suggest it to you. Can't do that slide. Skip that. No, not going to happen. Is there any evidence showing that we can put kids in frustration level text that in the past we would have said you needed to avoid, or kids couldn't possibly learn, and scaffold them, support them in such a way that they will perform in that material as if it was at their instructional level, as if they could recognize 95% of the words, as if they could comprehend 75% of the text. And you know what? It turns out that there are a whole bunch of such studies. In fact, there are even more than that. Slew of such studies. And so I want to show you, there are all kinds of scaffolds and supports we can provide kids. I'm just going to stay to the area of language for the rest of this presentation. And boy, for those of you who have second language kids or poverty kids who you don't think have the language, the English language development that they need to be able to read really well, I hope you'll pay really close attention. First one is one that everybody does. So why am I talking about it? Because we do it badly. We do it badly. The most obvious thing to most teachers, the most obvious thing to most kids, the most obvious thing to principals in the room, if kids are going to struggle with a particular text, if you want them to do well with it, teach them some of the words. You teach them some of the words, they perform better in the text than they would if they didn't know those words. No brainer. The question is, what words should we be teaching them? What are the words that you present to kids to help them to understand the text? And I would tell you, I would suggest to you that there are words we shouldn't be teaching that we're teaching right now, that we're taking up good time for, that should be used for real instruction. Look at this particular passage. This is a 4th grade passage, and it's real typical of a lot of science materials for kids. Why is the teacher pre-teaching the word photosynthesis for a science book that's going to tell kids what photosynthesis is? Well, that way they'll get it. Yeah, except they're supposed to get it from the reading. Right? That's why it's explained explicitly in the text. It's defined by the author. Why is that on the pre-reading word list? Go through and look at your science material. Go through and look at your social studies material. Frankly, even go through and look at some of the core reading programs, and what you're going to see is they select words that the author defines, which the kids should be actually trying to make sense of those definitions. That's what you have to comprehend in those texts. Foolish word to teach. Or look at a text like this. Just a few sentences that I've pulled. I highlighted 3 of the words. The reason I highlighted those is because those are words that the program that this came from wanted to teach. My question for you is simply, do you believe your boys and girls could have figured out the meanings of any of those words? Just, if you didn't tell them and they only have this text, could they get anything out of it? We might disagree on some of them, but there's some there. I see people nodding, oh, well, of course, I think glaciers. Because they'll know it's something icy. They'll know it because it has to melt. They'll get that. So then again, what I'm going to ask you, if you're going to have kids going in and taking tests like the ACT and PERC and all these things, what do they do when they're in that testing situation and they come to a word they don't know? What we should be, I'd love to everyone to say, well, they try to figure it out from context. But why would they ever do that if we always, before they confront such words in the text in the classroom, we're telling them what those words mean? Why aren't we identifying those words and then studiously not teaching those ahead of time? Forcing the kids to go in and give it a try. If they don't get it, you can always tell them. But guiding them to figure it out so when they're on their own. I know I was at one table, teacher said, their principal said, kids read a sentence, they come to a word they don't know, they stop with that sentence. They're discouraged, they don't know what to do with it. Guess what? If that's the daily routine, and the teacher says, hey kids, did you figure out what seeps means? Instead of, let me tell you what seeps means before you read this so you don't have to think about it. big change, big shift. I'm going to skip that one. What I would suggest is we need to focus on words that make a difference in comprehending the text. We shouldn't be pre-teaching words that are explicitly defined. We shouldn't be pre-teaching words that can be figured out from context. Last thing on this item, let me go back. You notice I didn't say teach here, I didn't say pre-teach here. We've been conducting a study in Title I classes, almost 1,000 Title I classes around the United States for the last few years. I can tell you that there's probably not a more dismal part of boys and girls school days than when teachers are pre-teaching vocabulary. Those are the most painful lessons. They go on forever. It's not necessary. Frankly, folks, we can tell them very quickly the words that we want them to know, or as they get a little bit older, you can give them a glossary, for Christ's sakes. Any of you read on an iPad or a Kindle? Have you gotten where you just punt? Oh, isn't that wonderful? I look up a lot more words when they're right there. And so the notion of the teacher saying, kids, we could spend the next half hour me preparing you to read this. You can't do this with the little ones, but you can do this with, heck, by the time kids are certainly partway through second grade. Here, there are 8 words here that I thought were going to give you trouble. I've written down the definitions. When you come to them, just look it up. It's right there. You don't have to go any place. You don't have to turn any pages. We don't have to overdo this. We just have to tell kids the meanings and let it move on. I really do think we need to go through text ahead of time and find the words that we want to really teach, but that we're not going to pre-teach because the text defines them. Same thing with the words that are defined in context. We want to ask them questions about those so we can focus their attention and get them to figure it out. And then there's some words that we really do want to pre-teach because the author isn't going to give them a clue. I did one that everybody does. I bet none of you have a teacher in your schools that doesn't pre-teach vocabulary. I bet none of you have a program in your schools in reading or any of the other subjects that doesn't give you guidance in how to pre-teach vocabulary. Let me switch to something we don't teach. Explain clearly using at least 3 different reasons or drawing 3 diagrams why McClellan lost the battle, or explain clearly why McClellan lost the battle, give at least 3 reasons or draw 3 diagrams. Which of those is easier to understand? Second one, yeah. I mean, everyone says second one. And there's no question you're right. But here's the question. The first one is actually in perfectly good English. The grammar is fine. Why aren't we teaching our boys and girls to read the first one instead of always moving them to the second one? Right? So I pulled this out of a 5th grade textbook. This is a sentence that I thought would give 5th graders some trouble. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. It's 26 words long. It's got 5 commas. It's got parentheses. It's got an acronym. It's got numbers. My bet is it'll give kids some trouble. I can be wrong. I see lots of nods. You don't think I am. That's cool. Is there a verb in that sentence? Did anyone find one? May. Yeah. The 24th word. Psychologists tell us that when you try to interpret a sentence, or what they refer to as a proposition, you look for the verb. You might not know you're doing it, but you look for a verb. Once you find the verb, you start trying to connect things to it. So, who made what, that kind of stuff. Imagine a 10-year-old reading this sentence. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, by the point the kid gets to there, he goes, out of hell with it. There must not be a verb. When we talk to each other, we make the verb like the second or third word, so it's real easy to find. And of course, the kid who decides astronomical must be the verb is in big trouble. So what do you do with it? Well, what you should do, I wouldn't pre-teach this like I would pre-teach vocabulary, but I would handle this like I was suggesting handling sentences in words in context. I would have a question set up. First of all, I would read this text before the kids do. There's a real plus. You want to raise achievement, have the teachers read the books before the kids read them. That doesn't happen often enough. And I would ask the teachers when they do that reading to look for sentences that they think are going to be butt kickers for the kids. Let's be really clear about this. What's going to trip them up? This was a sentence I bet on. I could be wrong. So let's have a question on. What if you ask the kids, what did the IAU do? If they can answer the question, So you ask, tell them to read this page or this section. They read it. You say, hey kids, what did the IAU do? The kids all go, I know you always have that one, the Statue of Liberty girl who always has her arm up in the harbor. I'm not talking about her. The rest of the kids, they're all flipping pages and going, What I would do is, well, let's break the sentence down. If you can't answer that, let's see if we can figure it out. Look at where made is. I would actually draw the kids' attention. Look at the subject of the sentence, that blue part. See why people have trouble reading science? This is real common in science writing. You get these huge subjects that go on forever. And then there's the verbs kind of hidden. So I showed the kids that. Now, I had a teacher at some district that was in someplace in the United States, and she said, oh, I really like this. This would really help kids. I said, yeah. She says, but we don't have LCD projectors in our classrooms. So we do that. And so my response was, do you have pencils? Because honestly, what I would do with the boys, I'm serious. What I would do with the boys and girls is exactly what I did with you. Can you find a verb? Let's go in and find the verb. Let's underline the verb, and then figure out what was made and who made it. You don't need all that equipment. Let me give you another example. This is 4th grade. The women of Montgomery, both young and older, would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower or some velvet trimming or something to make the ladies look festive. 44 words, 2 commas and an M dash. My bet is your 9-year-olds are going to struggle with it. Beautiful text, good writer, all that kind of stuff. But guess what, guys? Kids aren't reading it. We assigned it, they read it, they could answer other questions on the page, I know. But I would lie in wait with the kids. I would have a question about what the women of Montgomery did. And if the kids can't answer it, now I have something to teach. I have something to guide them so that they know what to do. One of the things I would suggest to you is the parts between commas in sentences is often an extra idea. What if we set that idea aside for a moment? What if we just, with the magic of technology, I'll take it away. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just touch. Frankly, what I just did for some kids, I just solved the problem. And for other kids, it's still too hard. So don't let me off the hook too quickly. Where else can we break? And there are lots of places you can break sentences. You can break at conjunctions. You can break at words like that and which. What are those relative pronouns? You can break at in thens and those kinds of things. I found some ors, ands and ors. Found ors and punctuation here. So I broke this one down. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments. A lot of kids are going, hey, I got that. That makes sense. Or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower or some velvet trimming or something. This I thought was too choppy, so I put it back together. Who works with Latino boys and girls? Oh, a bunch. Oh, gosh, I had no idea. But everybody did. Almost everybody. A lot of those kids are going to understand this part, and they're going to fall apart here on this on this clause, on this. Or their Sunday suits and blouses that need to just touch. Spanish doesn't work like that, so they'd be a little lost in it. They don't know about dependent clauses, so we can show them that in fact, look at their fancy holiday dresses, their Sunday suit. It's parallel, right? It's got to connect up to something. In fact, I can even go farther. I can really help. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments. Or the women of Montgomery would come in with their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch. Hey, wait a minute, I'm getting this. This is cool. What I'm doing is something that's called sentence reduction, or you can look up stuff online, sentence combining. Here's one specifically for Spanish speakers, little kids. One day when he grows up a bit, Mickey will be a helping dog. Spanish speakers might have, young Spanish speakers learning English might have trouble with that. So let's break at the punctuation first. One day when he grows up a bit, Mickey will be a helping dog. For some of your kids, again, I've done everything I needed. For Spanish kids, Spanish-speaking kids, one of the things that makes that hard for them is the verb phrase. Auxiliary verbs. They don't have auxiliary verbs. They don't have that dual verb in Spanish. So breaking it out like that all of a sudden makes that sentence easier to understand. Future tense is also hard for second language kids, so showing them that, breaking that out, allows them to make sense of that. Or look at this one. It's likely that the faucet is made from iron, the pipes are made of copper, and the basin is made from iron or clay. And again, the easy split would be to break it at the punctuation. But again, for Spanish speakers, you're going to probably find that reinstantiating that part that makes it an independent clause instead of a dependent clause will show them how to do that, how to think like that, how to recognize how English is used. And again, another example, same kind of idea that I've pushed it even farther, breaking it out. The point of what I'm saying is that we ought to be identifying the complex sentences, designing questions that will assess the comprehension of those sentences. If the kids get the sentences right, you predicted wrong. If the kids can read that sentence with understanding, they clearly could interpret the grammar, don't worry about it. If you're right, if you've made a good choice, then what we ought to be doing is showing kids how to break those sentences down in the different places, reducing those, figuring out what they have to say, and if you do that, don't be surprised if kids get much higher comprehension. One more example and I'll shut up, I promise. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it, or the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Which one of those is easier? Second one is easier, especially for second language kids, but not just for second language kids. Why is it easier? Well, because connecting penguin to prey is harder than connecting penguin to penguin. Texts are not just lists of words. They're not just lists of sentences. The sentences have to cohere. The ideas have to connect. The way we connect ideas in this language is through repetition, through synonyms, through pronouns, through conjunctions. But who's teaching kids how to think about that as they're reading? So, again, this is a 5th grade example. And when I say 5th grade, I mean this is now in 5th grade books, even though in the past this would have been 6th or 7th grade because of the new standards. We're pushing this stuff down. So kids are confronting this kind of language earlier and earlier. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around it. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun, coolest at its outer edge. As the disk swirled around the sun's gravity went to work. It pulled and tugged at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas until they came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. My bet is a lot of 10-year-olds are going to read that passage if the teacher assigns it, and they're going to go, I have no idea what I just read. I don't know what it's about. And when the teacher says, what did that describe, or what was the scientific process being summarized there, they would be turning pages or telling you it was that protoplanetary thing, or all the stuff that kids do, blowing their nose, anything to keep the focus off of answering the question. That'd be a good time to drop your book on the floor, right? Go down and get it. Hope the teacher forgets you're there. And so, in really good classrooms, heck, if you go up to Wilmette and stuff, I suppose what a teacher does in a situation like that is says to the boys and girls, come to my desk. I knew you'd have trouble with that. I have an animation on my computer. Let me show you how planets are formed, and I'll run that off for you. And what I would suggest is that good advantaged teacher isn't really such a good teacher because she's surrendered without firing a shot. What we need to do is push the kids back into the text. Let's figure this text out. So the first question I would ask the boys and girls about this one is, what's the first scientific concept that's presented in that passage? The nebula. So let's highlight the nebula, and let's highlight any other words that refer to the nebula. Let's draw a line under them. Now, this is like the cooking shows, but I've already made one for you. I can pull this out and show you. So happy to be able to do this. I feel like Julia Child up here if I just had a chicken. Okay, so the nebula orbits the sun until it being... the nebula orbits the sun until the nebula forms a large flat ring. And the next idea, the sun. So the nebula orbits the sun until the nebula forms a large flat ring around the sun. it comes up twice in that first sentence. One time it means nebula, one time it means sun. I wonder why some of your kids might be struggling. The disk is hottest where it's closest to the sun. The disk swirls around the sun. And now we get the third big idea, a flat ring. The nebula orbits the sun until the nebula forms a large flat ring around the sun. This ring, this protoplanetary disk, this ring is hottest where the ring. Now you told me nebula meant. You're confusing me. You first said it was nebula, then you said it was sun, and now you're telling me it means ring. Oh, you guys are terrible. Hottest where the ring was closest to the sun, and coolest at the ring's outer edge, and the disk swirled around the sun. And now the sun's gravity goes to work. It's like Freddy Krueger, it's back. The sun's gravity goes to work. The sun's gravity pulls and tugs at the bits of rock and so on. And then finally, we get the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas. They're getting tugged at by that sun's gravity, right? Until they being the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas, they come together in clumps of material. Synonyms we're getting, right? And we now call those clumps of material the planets. I bet a lot more of your kids could get it if somebody would show kids how the language connects like that and how to follow that in science, for example. It gets pretty, too. But I have a couple other real short ones. There were several roads nearby, but it did not take her long to find the one paved with yellow bricks. What's this from? Wizard of Oz. And the question I have for you is, what the heck does one mean? The roads. Guys, I know it's late, but when you go home in a few minutes, I hope you will go to your thesaurus and look up roads. I want to find how many of them have one as a synonym for roads. That's those indefinite pronouns. You know, his and hers are hard enough, right? The he's and she's are hard enough. But the ones and the any's, the somes, those are really tough for a lot of kids who are low in language to make those connections. But look at this one. Surely, said John, like one who had lost faith in his memory, he used not to sleep in the kennel. John, Wendy said falteringly, perhaps we don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did. We did what? Huh? What does did connect to? We don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did. A lot of second language kids are sitting there going, what did she do? She did. Did what? That sentence just sort of died there. And what you figure out, of course, perhaps we don't remember the old life as well as we thought we remembered the old life. Oh, okay, I get that. Again, who's teaching kids this? And these examples, these short examples that I pulled, these fall especially hard on second language kids, just so you know. I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats could grin. They all can, said the Duchess, and most of them do. I don't know of any that do, Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. And again, if you look at the kinds of things, well, here's the dialect, where do you connect that to? Here's one of those indefinite pronouns, where do you connect that to? Our texts are replete with this kind of thing because they're English. That's the nature of the language. The assumption right now is as long as kids can decode the text into language, then they'll just interpret it fine, and then they just have to think about it effectively. We're teaching the one that get them started, we're teaching them at the end. But what about the middle? And I would suggest we're not doing much of it. Oh, we teach grammar. And nobody's ever found that teaching formal grammar raises reading comprehension or writing quality. But teaching the kinds of things I've just been demonstrating to you and showing you, actually there's a substantial body of research saying those raise both comprehension and rating quality. I wonder if we're missing a beat here. Spanish speakers have particular difficulty with abstract pronouns and with gender markers. The reason? It's done differently in their home language. Nothing wrong with the kids. It's just the features of the language are different, so if someone actually shows them how to follow that in English, it gives them a leg up. Instead of, well, yeah, some of them are figuring that out now. Yeah, I know they are. All by themselves. Sharp kids, right? They could really be superstars with a little help. Let's give them some help. If you want some resources on this, you want some information about this, this article is made available, I'm told, online by Educational Leadership for free. You don't have to pay anything for this, so it's a giveaway. This is a piece that Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry and I wrote a while back, but it should be of some use to you. Folks, I think this notion of asking teachers to teach kids with harder text, teach kids to negotiate language, is a really good idea, but it's only a good idea if we're willing to do more than just throw kids into harder text. And that we ought not to be doing it too early. So first grade teacher, please don't do this to the kids yet. But the rest of, certainly beyond that, we ought to be putting them in harder text. We ought to be giving them the kinds of support and guidance that doesn't tell them what the text says, but helps them to figure it out. If we start doing that, I can imagine kids taking a park test or whatever comes down the road, and those kids are in there all by themselves. They don't have a teacher there pre-teaching vocabulary. They don't have a teacher there asking them questions and breaking the text down. But the kids are going, I've read text this hard in my classroom, and I know what to do when I come to a word I don't know. Sometimes even figure it out, because we do that every day. And man, there's a killer sentence there. I used to just stop reading the text at that point and start answering questions. But I know how to break it down. The teacher's been doing that with us all year. I can break that down. And man, I don't know what the heck they're talking about here, but I bet if I follow some of those subjects and start connecting this stuff up, I can make sense of it. In fact, I think you'll not just see kids who are getting 1 or 2 more questions on a standardized test. I think over time we'll see kids who are coming up 6 months, 9 months, 12 months over where they have in the past. We're not talking little reading gains. We're talking big reading gains. The kind of reading gains that, frankly, the district will come and retest your kids because they'll be sure you were cheating. It wasn't a very good example of close reading. I'm not sure what Doug is saying that we're disagreeing on this. Usually we're pretty much agreement. I think close reading is a really good idea, but close reading doesn't help you to deal with the language demands that I'm talking about here. It's a different thing. In fact, some districts invite me to come in and talk about close reading because they think it addresses this stuff, and it doesn't. 2 concepts of complex text. One is complex text has deep ideas, sophisticated ideas, and another one is it has sophisticated language. In the standards that our state has adopted, both of those concepts are important. Both, not one of them. Close reading helps you to think about those sophisticated ideas. It doesn't help you deal with the complexity of the language in any way. Our kids need both. I was just talking about the one, so maybe it looks like I'm emphasizing something that he's blowing off. I don't think so, but I hope not.
No, and I only brought that up and being
it's a good question. It's cool.
Yeah,
no, it's a cool question.
As well, because of when you teach teachers, they do want something they can grab onto, that they can
Absolutely.
teach their kids annotation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know. And annotation becomes the game in close reading,
Absolutely.
which isn't what close reading is even about.
And that's what happens.
And we keep doing that kind of thing, guys. You take a concept that has a lot of features, and we take one of the more obvious features and blow it up into the whole thing. Close reading is not annotating text. Close reading is not rereading text. Close reading is reading a text where you solve multiple interpretive goals only using evidence from the text, not any external evidence, not other sources, not the teacher, not your background, only using information from the text to make sense of it. And while I say there are multiple interpretive goals, there's one goal that really stands out, and that's special to close reading, and that's figuring out how a text works, how the author is using his approach to organizing information or the word choices to either reinforce or to extend his ideas. And I can give examples of that if I need to, but you get, and that's what close reading is. And then you say, well, yeah, but don't you have to reread? It's really helpful. You're going to have to go back to the text again and again. So that's part of close reading, but it's certainly not a central tenet of it. There's certainly things, shallow things that I've seen. Anybody ever watch the Housewives of whatever?
Never heard of it.
Isn't that the most shallow TV show? Is there a more shallow TV show? Does anyone know one that's worse? I don't want to pick on them, but that's probably the worst.
With the little girl.
Honey Boo.
Honey Boo.
See, that one I just never watched. I just couldn't bring myself to it. I'm sorry. Yeah, that might be worse. Or the other one where the guys go out, the duck gun, you know. That I haven't seen either, but that doesn't look so wonderful. No. My point is, you could give those a close reading, but you probably don't need to watch them over and over again because they're so thin, right? I mean, there's not much there. In fact, I was doing a high school workshop on Saturday, and I had a teacher come in. We've been doing Friday and Saturday. She'd gone out with her family Friday night, and they'd gone to see a movie, I think, called The Box Trolls. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this because I have grandkids. And she was trying to do a close read of it with her kids. So why do some of the box trolls have red hats, and why do some of the people have red hats, and why do some of them have white hats? And they said to her, "Mom, it's a movie. It's supposed to be fun. You're not supposed to think about it." But the fact is, you can watch a film like that once, and you can start doing a close read of it. But certainly, if the material has sufficient depth, you're going to have to go back to it again and again. Rereading something doesn't make it close reading. It's helpful. You can speed the process along if you can take some notes, because then you can come back and find the stuff you wanted to look at again. But frankly, if you don't annotate a text, it could still be close reading. So those are useful tools. I'm not arguing against them. It's cool that your kids are learning how to do that, and yet you could learn all of that stuff and still not be a close reader. That worries me, and that was what I saw New York doing. They were pushing all the parts that weren't essential and ignoring all the parts that mattered. And I doubt that Doug has done that, but if he is, shame on him. I'll take care of that. He's a friend. I'll fix that. But it's a good question. It's fair. Thank you. Anything else?
One more question.
Oh, take as many as you want. Go ahead.
So the idea, I'll go back to your scenario, fourth grade class with the second grade readers.
Yeah.
And would you agree that those fourth grade readers reading at second grade level, that they still do need to read some second grade material or at that level to become better readers, yet still at appropriate times during the day with the whole class, with everybody else, be exposed to a higher level text and be able to take the text apart like you were showing?
Are there any athletes in the room? Any marathoners, long distance cyclists, swimmers, weightlifters? What is it? What do you do? What have you done? You run a marathon? Fun, huh? I've done one too. Here in Chicago, you did your marathon? Yeah, me too. I did one of the hot years. One of the things that athletes learn and trainers of athletes learn is you don't want athletes doing all their training at the same level of difficulty. You want to vary the levels of difficulty. That's how you get stronger. This morning, yesterday I'd been sort of laid off for a while because I've been working all these days, but yesterday I had a day off. First time in 8 days. And so I went to run on the treadmill. And I found myself walking an awful lot. At my age, it goes away real fast, kids. And so what I did today is I went down, and when I got up this morning, and I started trying to build some strength again. And the way you build strength is you vary the difficulty. So, in fact, there was an article in the Chicago Tribune about this morning, if any of you read the paper this morning. And in fact, it's what inspired me to go and work a little bit. And I went down and I ran. First of all, I ran 5 minutes real slow and walked and just took it easy, got myself warmed up. And then I did 2 minutes at 6 miles an hour, which isn't crazy fast, but it was pushing me a little bit. And then I backed off for 2 minutes and I ran again about 5 miles an hour. So I can walk at 5 miles an hour, so that's not bad. But then after 2 more minutes, I was running 6.5 miles an hour, which now I'm starting to stretch a little bit, but not terrible. And then 2 minutes of 5 miles again. And then 2 minutes of 7 miles an hour. Now I'm breathing hard. Now I'm sweating. And then 2 minutes of 5 miles an hour. And then 2 minutes of 7.5 miles. I got up to 9 miles an hour and ran the full 2 minutes. Now that's where you build muscle. That's where you actually start to get cellular growth. I mean, we know that. That's true. That's not just true for running. It's true for any physical kind of activity. In fact, there was an article I read yesterday saying how important it is that you do intensive work, not just moving around like we do with our Fitbits. What does that have to do with your question? I can't think of a part of reading, this notion of negotiating language and dealing with challenging text, that isn't more like physical fitness. The rest of it is different. The rest of it is more intellectual and so on. I believe our boys and girls should be doing, one, a heck of a lot more reading in school than they are now. So for those of you, we were talking a bit about instruction. The reading kids do within instruction is extremely important, and I bet there's too little of it in your schools. I would be trying to ramp that up. But your point, but you wouldn't want all that exercise to be at the same level of intensity, would you? And the answer is no, I would not. I would want it to vary from things that people can do an easy sprint on to things that frankly kick their butt and they can't do it without help. Because I want them to both get stronger and I want them to use it, right? You consolidate your gains. I don't think our kids are reading enough. I don't think they're reading a varied enough appetite. I don't think they're reading, some of those texts aren't hard enough, and when they are hard enough, they're not getting enough support or instruction. So I think we've got a lot of areas of that I talked about that you could, there's a slide I stripped out of here. I actually show you if you go online and look up these kinds of presentations of mine online, what you'll see is that usually one of the last slides shows a marathon training schedule. You go out and you run 3 miles, then you run 5 miles, then you run 3 miles, then you run 4 miles, then you run 3 miles, then you run 7 miles, then you run 3 miles. You know, it constant. They even get people up to 8 miles and they take them back to 3. And so should your students be doing some reading that's at the instructional level or even easier than that? And the answer is yes, they should. Should they be doing some reading that's harder? In fact, I would even argue even harder than what the standards or what the tests are going to go after? Absolutely. I'm not against that either. What I would suggest, you at the very end of what you were asking me, darling, you asked about, whole class or whatever. The fact is, if you think about how we do this in schools, if your school's using a core program, odds are on Monday what that means is kids get a whole class instruction with a grade level piece of material. In other words, a challenging text that will probably kick their butts. And it's one teacher to 25 or 30 or 32 kids, whatever the numbers are in your school. And then on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, they're going to work in leveled books that are at their level, and the teacher's going to get up close when the kids are at their level. Which means we're preparing these lessons so that when the kids are dealing with really hard text, we can't scaffold. And when they're working with really easy text, we scaffold like crazy. Think about that. So when you're trying to run your first 15 miles, we're not going to help you at all. But if you want to run another 3, I'll help you all you want, darling. You don't need it then. If you think of how we've organized our schools, when the kids go down to the pull-out reading teacher, they're going to work at their level. When they go down and work with the special ed teacher in a group of 3 kids or 5 kids or 4 kids or 2 kids, they're going to work at their instructional level. And then in the classroom, when there are 32 kids and 1 non-specialized teacher, then they're going to work at grade level. Let's start rethinking some of that, guys. I mean, it's such a good question. It has so much to it, and yet we don't think through its implications. And so you say, well, let's start turning that over. Man, when you're down in the special ed room, I want you dealing with the kick-ass text. This is going to really wear these kids out, and yet I have somebody there with only 4 kids who's really a good teacher, who knows what she's doing, who can actually give the kids the support making sense of that. And then in the classroom, if the teacher wants to drop back to something easier because she can't help them, that would make some sense. But we're not organized that way. Nobody's got their school set up that way. But we could. That's up to us, right? I mean, so there are a lot of implications to this that I don't think people are grasping. Your question puts your finger right on it. So, guys, we can do this.